So the structure of what I'll talk about, and I'll talk about 3 postings in the Middle East. I'll then talk about 2 particular tragedies that I was involved with, and then I'd like to pick out 3 thoughts or 3 lessons which I picked out of those years. So starting with Doha, this is a picture of Doha in about the 1920s. It's a dusty little town in Qatar. It was protected by the British colonial times, but at that time it was poverty-stricken, it was destitute, and it was extremely hot. And the British political agent who visited from Bahrain wrote and said, "It is my fate to strike heat waves of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The Sheikh's house is like a furnace. I spend most of my time sitting in a well." At that time, the Qataris only survived through pearl fishing. But in the 1930s, the Japanese invented a cultured pearl. The market for natural pearls collapsed, and the country hadn't yet discovered oil. And during the Second World War, they were burning their boats to try and cook themselves food. So it was a very traditional, very tribal society. But then in came oil. In the 1950s, they had huge amounts of oil. By the time we arrived in 1981, this is actually the Women's Hospital in Doha, where our oldest daughter was born in 1984. But I was second secretary in the embassy. I was doing trade promotion. I later was doing political reporting and doing a bit of defense sales. At that time, the main issue in the region was the war between Iran and Iraq. But the expeditionary nature of what we were trying to do was how to make contact with and understand the local people and the local culture. Of a population at that time of only about 300,000 people, only about 50,000 were Qataris. The country was run by the ruling tribe, and it was extremely difficult to get to know local people. The thing that I used to do was I would find recent graduates from the UK or from the United States. I would invite them round in the evening, but I found that if they came by themselves, they would quietly ask if they could have a beer or a glass of whiskey. And that was the only way I could get people to open up and get them to talk about what it was like, particularly what it was like for these young men to go and study in a place like the United Kingdom, where they had freedom to drink, freedom to talk to people, freedom of expression, democracy, and so forth, and come back to a very, very traditional society. The extent of change was always reflected in a picture which was often on the front of the annual, the year book, which they would talk about the progress that they would make. And one of the yearbooks had a photograph of a roundabout. The roundabout meant that they had cars, they didn't need to depend on camels. It had grass, which meant that they had water, and it had a light, which meant that they had electricity, they had air conditioning, they didn't need to live in tents anymore, and they had a much more comfortable life. And you saw the picture of the 1920s. This is what Doha looks now. You could argue that it's not much prettier now than it was back then. That is the modern developments, and of course, in a couple of years' time, they'll be hosting the World Cup in Qatar. Moving on now to Jordan. So I arrived in Jordan in 2011 as ambassador. This is Petra. Some of you might have visited this wonderful place of Petra, but I arrived just as the Arab Spring, the so-called Arab Spring, was kicking off. But I recall my colleague who was the ambassador in Tunisia at the time, he had reported back to London in November 2010, and he had written that Tunisia is the most stable country in North Africa. Within a month, the revolution kicked off, their dictator Ben Ali had been kicked out, and the domino effect in Egypt had happened. And everybody was worried that Jordan, as not democratic, but as a monarchy, would be susceptible to the same sort of pressures of democratization and public will that had happened in other countries. It didn't happen in Jordan. The monarchy survived, but it was a country where, again, getting out and understanding the country was the main nature of being expeditionary. This is Wadi Rum in the south of the country, and again, it's a very tribal society. It was divided between the tribes of east bank of the River Jordan and the Palestinians who had left the West Bank to come into Jordan. So understanding that dynamic was tricky. Just close to this town, just close to this area of Wadi Rum, there's a rather dusty, dirty town called Ma'an. Ma'an survives by smuggling alcohol into Saudi Arabia. I went down there on an official visit. I was met by the local police who drove me to a big house, a big building where there were lots of people having a meal. And I went in and they gave me a table. We sat down. I began to realize that we were in the wrong place. The police had taken us to the wrong place to eat. But we eventually left and we went to the place where we were supposed to meet members of parliament and other people. But for me, it illustrated the fact that the traditional culture of welcoming, I don't know who this person is, but I will welcome him, give him something to eat because I might be isolated and lost in the desert, and I would hope that he would do the same for me. But again, getting to know and understand that culture. Within the city of Amman, there was an elite area called Abdoun. We used to talk about the Abdoun bubble, which was Anglophone, educated, wealthy. That was not the country that we were trying to understand. The royal connection was very strong. In the middle here, we have the King of Jordan with Prince Charles. Prince Charles visited twice while we were there. And that royal connection made a huge difference. The King of Jordan himself served in the British Army for some time. King Hussein, of course, his father had a strong connection, was educated in Harrow. Prince Ghazi and Princess Sumaya also here were educated at British schools and universities. So that connection was a great door opener and it helped access a great deal. These are two mugs I was given, which illustrate two of the challenges and the expeditionary nature of what we were trying to do. This mug on the left, which I'm afraid is rather faded, shows me rolling up my sleeve and eating the local dish of mansaf, which is a large dish of rice with a cooked sheep on top, lots of pine nuts and a sort of yogurty, hot yogurt poured on top of it. You had to eat it by hand. You had to stand with all the other, and it was only men standing around. One of the places I went to, because I was often invited by the members of parliament, and we were all standing around eating this meal. One of my colleagues sidled up to the member of parliament and whispered in his ear and said, you know, the ambassador really loves the tongue. And the member of parliament came along, he reached into the sheep's mouth, pulled out the tongue, shredded it and put it in front of me. What do? You have to have it. The mug on the right illustrates one of the other challenges, which is the myth that the British support the Muslim Brotherhood and support terrorism and are actively have a policy of dividing and rule in the Middle East. And whatever we did, whatever we said, we could not break down these myths. And I use these both as illustrations of how difficult it was to break through and really get people talking about what they really felt and really wanted in their countries in terms of future development. The other big challenge we faced was refugees from Syria. This area here is Zatri camp. When I first visited it in 2012, it was a dusty, empty piece of desert just south of the Syrian border. And within 6 months, it had become a city of 120,000 people. All of these tents were supplied by the UN. The UK was one of the main donors to the United Nations. We had visitors. David Cameron came, he stood on the border with Syria and waved his arm across and said, this man, Assad has to go. And then he visited, Prince Charles visited, Prince Charles actually told me it was the first time he'd ever been to a refugee camp, which I found rather surprising. But it was a place where you could see Syrian entrepreneurship growing. There was a central road, which they for some reason called the Champs-Élysées, and down there you could buy wedding dresses, you could buy some of the best falafel we had anywhere in the Middle East, you could buy SIM cards to phone back to Syria. It was a very entertaining and interesting place. Two of our daughters used to go up there with Save the Children, and they would teach the children simple songs. They came back once and told us that they'd been teaching them to sing head, shoulders, knees, and toes. But in the middle of it, the children really joyously singing something like head, shoulders, knees, and toes. A helicopter went overhead, and the children's faces turned from joy to fear, and they all ducked under the table, because that's what they had been used to in Syria. Moving on now to Libya. So I arrived in Libya 2015 as ambassador and spent 3 years there. Of course, you'll all recognize Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi, who was the dictator of Libya from 1969 to 2011. In 2011, the revolution happened. The city was full of graffiti. This was the Libyan flag, which they reintroduced after the revolution. And the Arabic there says, "We will not return to our chains." This is Cameron and Sarkozy visiting Benghazi and celebrating the fall of Gaddafi. There were high expectations and high euphoria at the time that democracy would bring massive and rapid change to Libya, a country with the largest oil reserves in Africa and a population of only 6 million people. Elections took place. Here's a lovely picture of the elections taking place. You can again see the euphoria and the joy and the women who are voting for the very first time. But I'm afraid it all collapsed into civil war in 2014. The embassy had to evacuate in 2014. So when I started in 2015, I was in Tunis. And in fact, I spent most of my time at this negotiation, which was in Morocco. These are the various groups of people from Libya. We managed to negotiate a political deal, which brought the various sides together. The man in the middle here, Fayez Sarraj, became and is still the president and prime minister of Libya. But the expeditionary nature of this was that I was trying to help the United Nations negotiate a deal with a group of Libyans, and I had never been to Libya. I hadn't met Libyans on the ground, or actually had an opportunity to understand from Libyans themselves what they actually wanted. So my first ever visit to Libya was in April 2016. 3 ambassadors went, so I'm with the French ambassador and with the Spanish ambassador, and all the other people around us were security people. We were only able to land in Tripoli and be driven to the naval base under heavy guard, where we met the members of the Presidency Council, the new Prime Minister. But our aim was to show European solidarity. We were members of the EU at the time, so this was part of the sort of EU delegation going and showing European solidarity and support for that political process. We had contacts with a wide range of different people. So the man in the middle here, General Heftar, was the man who started the civil war. And in April 2019, he launched a year-long bombardment of Tripoli. My aim was to go to him and talk to him and try to persuade him that politics was the answer rather than military means. He wanted to be a new dictator of Libya. I actually took Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson to see him in April 2017, which I have to say was not a meeting of minds. The man on the right there, Wanis Boukoumada, in the black shirt, is actually the head of Libyan Army's Special Forces. I don't think you get away with a tummy like that in British Special Forces. But again, he was an interesting person to talk to about how the military were operating. At the time, there was terrorism that they were fighting, but Heftar's aim was clearly a political takeover. So access, influence, and impact, that's what we were trying to achieve. We're trying to use our ability to travel to Tripoli and so forth. This is the visit of Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary in May 2017. And he's talking to Fayez Sarraj, the President and Prime Minister, trying to persuade him to bring the sides together. Fayez Sarraj, in the 5 years that he was Prime Minister, he only once went to the east, and that was in 2015. He only once went to the south of the country. So he was not the sort of model person for trying to bring the country together. And what we were trying to do was try to influence him in a direction which we thought would be more constructive. Boris wanted his time to have his media opportunity, so we had to raise the flag in the garden of the old abandoned embassy. He landed at about 9 o'clock in the morning, and within 2 or 3 hours, my team had managed to find a flagpole, find a working mechanism and pulley to put it up, and found a flag which I'm pretty sure we managed to put up the right way. That was his soundbite. Unfortunately, the media complained that we hadn't cut the grass. But this is the theme of this, about the expeditionary nature of this, was how do you actually understand a country if you only talk to the political elite, and particularly with the constraints of security. I would try and get my security team to let me just go into a coffee shop. By that time, my face was fairly recognized. So I'm with the person on my right is John Morgan, who is my second secretary, very good Arabic speaker. The person on my left was Farouk, who is one of our local staff. But I would go in, sit down, a sort of, do you know who I am? And then they would open up. They would talk pretty openly. Many of them would say, we want more British involvement. We want the British to come back and help to run this country. But it was a way of trying to listen and understand what ordinary people were looking for. But the biggest constraint that we were facing was security. This is the ambassador's residence in Tripoli, and this is what happened to it in 2011. In 2011, during the revolution, the then ambassador and his team had to evacuate the embassy. As soon as they had evacuated, a mob of young men broke into the ambassador's house. They drank his wine cellar and they set fire to his house, to his residence. And this is actually, if you can see in the middle, a billiard table which is wrecked there. This house was full of beautiful art and personal souvenirs that the then ambassador had put in place, and this was the wreckage that was left. And everywhere we went, there was a risk of terrorist attack or getting caught up in the crossfire of the civil war. This is a United Nations armored vehicle, which was struck by a rocket-propelled grenade. Anybody with a military background will know that a rocket-propelled grenade takes 4 or 5 seconds to arm itself while it's in flight. This RPG was fired at point-blank range at this vehicle, so the grenade part of it didn't have time to arm, so it hit the vehicle without detonating, but it still made a lot of damage. Nobody in that vehicle was hurt or injured, but it did mean that wherever we went, so this is the compound that we lived in. This is the 10 houses, which was surrounded by armed guards, and this was my protection team. So the lady in the middle, Iona, was my deputy. The rest of them were all ex-British military, employed by a commercial company. They all were wearing sort of uniform dark glasses. There are actually two women in there who were drivers, but wherever I went, we had a convoy of 2 armed vehicles. I had 4 heavily armed men or women with me. We would practice various disciplines. If one vehicle broke down, how you shifted from one vehicle to the other. We had everywhere we went was recce'd in advance to make sure that we were safe. And I have to say, I felt very safe wherever I went, but it was a significant constraint on where we could go. I was able to go to Benghazi, to Tobruk, to Misrata, but our ability to actually travel and meet people was severely constrained. This is one of my favorite pictures from Libya. This is in Benghazi, the time I did manage to visit Benghazi. and I was having a meeting with 50 tribal leaders in the center of town. And this was a little demonstration outside. Peter is the big devil, and complaining about Western intervention in Libya. Libya was a fascinating experience. Unfortunately, the country is still in a mess, but I think we helped contribute to introducing a political process which is still underway. I'd like to move on briefly to two tragedies which I was involved in. So this is Athens in June 2000. I was the deputy head of mission there. The man on the right is Brigadier Stephen Saunders, who was the defense attaché. On the left is his Rover car that he was driving himself to work. The terrorist group, November the 17th, knew where he would hit traffic. When he slowed down and stopped in traffic, a man on a motorbike drove up a bit alongside him and shot him at point blank range. He died 2 or 3 hours later. It was followed up by Scotland Yard coming and helping the Greek police to investigate, and within 6 months that terrorist group have been rounded up and are still in jail. But it was a tragedy, a real trauma for the embassy. Trying to bring that embassy back together again was an extremely difficult process. The other tragedy was in Istanbul. So this is Pera House, the consulate as it is now, but it was built in the 1860s as the British embassy to the Ottoman Empire, one of the 5 great embassies that we had at the time. Magnificent building, but on the 20th of November 2003, a suicide vehicle crashed into the gatehouse. There was a barrier at the gatehouse which meant that they couldn't get further through. They detonated at that spot. 15 people in total were killed, 12 of whom were employees of the consulate. Most of them were the Turkish guards, but Roger Short, who was the consul at the time, was in the gatehouse, and nothing was ever found of his remains. His PA was also killed in that attack. At the time, I was the Foreign Office's Director of Security. So it led to a massive review of our buildings and of our security. We managed finally to get a bit of extra money out of the Treasury and managed to reinforce and move some of our buildings around the world. I think that illustrated the dangers that diplomats face around the world. I'd like to just finally say something of 3 themes particularly from Doha, Qatar, Jordan, but also Cyprus and Greece. The first is a question of identity. I've talked about reaching out, trying to understand a country. You have to understand how people identify themselves. So in Cyprus, are you Turkish, Turkish Cypriot, or Cypriot? Are you Greek, Greek Cypriot, or Greek? In Jordan, are you East Bank or West Bank? In Libya, are you Libyan? Are you tribal? Are you East, South, West? Understanding that, you can't understand a country, and you can't understand how to talk to people in that country without understanding how they themselves identify. If you look at our own country, Scots, the Welsh, the Irish, and so forth, you can see that identity for a diplomat coming to London, trying to understand identity would be a crucial part of their task. The second is the link between the economy and politics. We do tend, I think, in the Foreign Office to focus too much on politics and maybe on security and conflict resolution. Economic problems, economic issues are at the heart of political instability. The Arab Spring started with a young man in the south of Tunisia setting fire to himself because he couldn't sell his vegetables, couldn't feed his family, couldn't put bread on his family's table. If you look at Libya, the number of young men who have joined militias since 2012, when the government decided to pay all the militias, the number of young men in militias went from 50,000 to 250,000 because it was a job, it was a salary, it gave you the status of carrying a gun, and crucially, it allowed you to get married, because no father is going to let his daughter get married unless the young man is employed. So it's a strong driver. If you look at the protests, even before the bombing in Beirut, Protests in Beirut, in Jordan, in Tunisia, and elsewhere have all been about employment opportunities and the economy. And finally, diplomatic communication. The days when diplomats would communicate through the occasional interview, the occasional press release. Unless a diplomat now is on Twitter, is on Facebook, is doing blogs. In Libya, we used to do video blogs in Arabic and in English to try and get our messages across more effectively. The language is crucially important. Being able to speak the local language is a little bit like, it's a Heineken factor. It reaches the parts that other diplomats can't reach. So having the ability to speak the local language was crucial in trying to get those communications messages across. Those were the three thoughts. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and hopefully come back to being able to take any questions.